from there, go ahead and click on rating scales. Does anyone remember what rating scales are used for?
To normalize your data.
To normalize your data? Yeah. To evaluate a project, to rate a project? Yeah. Was I leading the witness there on rating scales? Okay. So this is where we get to Karen's point earlier about rating scales and how they evaluate your projects for your particular prioritization. So in this example, all of our portfolios are the same right now that we're working through this February 15th. So we'll all see the same minimum and maximum numbers, but as you generate portfolios of projects, they're going to have different minimums and maximums based on your project data. So in this case, I can see that I have the first one that's there is estimated impact on fatal and incapacitating injury crashes. So this is saying that based on the projects that are in here, the greatest impact that we're going to see is 2.9, an impact of 2.9 fatal and serious injury crashes reduced. And therefore, one of the projects must be hitting it on that level, and the rest of them must be lower than that to 0. So all the projects are going to score somewhere in between that. Now, I can go down this list and look at what that is for all of these if I want. But what I want to focus on and what I want you to focus on is actually the new criteria that we added. So you can see here in these images that there is one that's missing, and that's for skid number because that's the new one that we added. So John, right? So for skid number, what is a range for skid number? 1 to 100. Okay. So does everyone have skid number or whatever they added as their criteria selected? And it shows up as blank here. So what I want you to do is on the bottom, if you can see at the bottom, there are 2 of these linear scales or the lines. John, is 100, does that mean that's the worst number or is that the best number?
Best number.
The best number. So you'd want to focus on skid numbers that are lower. Okay. Slicker, got it. Okay. So I'm going to make this a decreasing scale because if it's a lower number, I want it to get the most value in my portfolio, meaning it's the most valuable thing to do. So I'm going to click on the decreasing scale, and I'm going to drag it up here, and I'm going to drop it on top of this, and it's going to create a decreasing scale from 0 to 100, meaning if it has a skid rating of 0, it gets a value of 1, which is the highest value you can get. If it has a skid rating of 100, it would receive a value of 0. Now, you could do an increasing scale, decreasing scale. It all depends on your particular criterion and how you're evaluating these things. Now, the question came up earlier. Yes?
So you said the scale was 1 to 100?
Yeah.
And you got 0. So when that 0 doesn't show up.
Oh, sorry about that.
I'm just curious, that shows a blank.
Oh, I'm going to change this to 1 here. So it's 1 to 100. You caught me on that one. It says 0 to 100. If you had left this as 0 to 100, that would mean that if a project scored 1, it wouldn't get a full 1. It would get a 0.99 value. Nothing would ever attain the highest possible point.
Would it have identified it as a blank?
It's based on the project. So if you had a project that had a skid rating of 1, it would receive a value of 0.99. If you had a value of 100, it would receive a value, if you had a skid rating of 100, it would receive a value in decision lines of 0. If it had a skid rating of 50, it would probably receive 0.5. There's no issues in doing that, but that's one of the reasons why you would want to make sure that your minimum and maximum are relevant to the project that you have. And the reason is because you never want to have a rating scale that a project can't hit. Otherwise, you're essentially leaving points on the table that no one can score on. If that makes sense.
But it wouldn't be blank, though. If you had something rated outside of that scale, it would still be either a 0 or a 1. If it somehow scored 150, possible, it would
source made the blank. If that blank would have shown up as a 0.
Oh. If you did not.
Does that blank show up?
Right.
Sometimes blanks show the zeros.
Yes, that's a good point. If you don't have a value for a project for one of your criteria, it doesn't score on that. It's not equated to a 0. It's equated to just not scoring at all. So I guess that could be a 0 value if you look at it that way. But I don't want to say that because in this case, a 0 actually gets value, right? It just means null, nothing. Okay.
Clear, by value you mean weight.
No, value. So value would be the raw score, and then the overall score for the value of the project, I know I'm using two words the same way, is a weighted value. This is the unweighted value, and then there's a weighted value after you have weights. Sorry.
So for your created criteria, where is it going to get that information?
So for this one, it's going to show up in our alternatives page as an empty cell now because it's new. And you would be able to either type it in because it's new, or you could import in a spreadsheet of all your projects and that value. And then it would assign them. So it depends on how if you're doing a one-off like this, it might make sense to just type in the number. If you were doing it for multiple new criteria in your model, you might decide to create a spreadsheet with all your projects, put in all the values, and import it in, because it would just be faster. Yeah. Let's see, Brenda, right? Brenda's point about the linear scale. So you can create a scale that's not linear. So in this case, in John's case, you have a skid rating. And I really want to focus on skid ratings that are somewhere between, that did not work the way I wanted it to work. Oops. 50. I want to focus on skid ratings that are somewhere between 1 and 50. I want those to get the majority of the weight in my model. Anything above 50, yeah, we want it to be addressed, but in reality, those are less important to me. So what I did here was I actually modified my rating scale. So I added a new point that maximized the value of projects between 1 and 50. Those are getting the most number of points in my model. And then from there, it drops off, because although I do want to make sure that we get additional points for those projects, they aren't as important to me. And this allows me to really focus on the projects in that range that I'm looking for. Okay. So that's rating scales from the perspective of adding. We also have these other ones down here that are qualitative, and I didn't really go into those because the majority of the TXDOT data is quantitative, it's numbers. But we do have the option of having qualitative responses too. So if you didn't actually have a number or a value to assign to projects for something, and you wanted to say it's good, fair, poor, something like that, something that's an expert's opinion or an evaluation from multiple people, you can set up the model to do that and allow people to enter that in. Something I'm not going to go through today because it doesn't really touch on what we're working on, but I want to let you know that that is there. All right. So, did that. What I'd like to do is jump down to permissions, please. And as we go to permissions, I want to show you in the slide deck, because this one's pretty important.
Where's permission?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, participants. Thank you. I'm glad you're paying attention. And I'm not. Participants. Yes, question.
It's writing, but what if that data element wasn't in the data from, because it got imported? When you add a field, because I didn't see skid in the
Oh, yeah.
data that got imported in.
Right. So yes, that's what we just went through, was we actually added SCID to the criteria list. It wasn't there before. We went into rating scales and created a scale for it. And what I haven't gone into yet is where you would enter that data in. But yes, that would be for a field where you didn't have it, it wasn't being brought in, but you want to make sure it's counted, essentially. Yeah.
So you can't.
Yes. Yeah.
One question there.
Yep.
Mildred was talking about like fully funded. That does not belong to any of the existing goals. So how do we add new goals as well to this so that we can assign these criteria to that particular goals?
Well, so for fully funded, I assume it would be yes or no. Like if I wouldn't.
So where do you put that?
Oh, okay.
Any of these buckets? Do you have like 4 different buckets?
Right.
Safety, preservation.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So let me. So the question for those on the phone is, if you wanted to see, so instead of fully funded, maybe like funded percent, funded percent funded, percent funded. So, what? Okay, so if you wanted to identify what percentage of this project is funded, because you needed to know that and you wanted to communicate that, the question I would ask you is, will that help you determine how valuable that project is for you? Or is it a piece of information that helps you filter and sort projects so that you can communicate it? And the reason I would ask that is because if the funding percentage holds value to projects, meaning projects that are more funded than others actually are more valuable to you to do, then I would say yes, it should be in the criteria list. And you could put it somewhere maybe as a parent criteria. You would assign a rating scale to it, and you would set that value. And that would be taken into consideration when you see the overall score of a project. However, if you just want to be able to communicate what is the funded percent of a project, and maybe you want to look up which projects are 50 or higher or things like that, we'd actually put it in as what we call an alternative category, not in the criteria list. And I'm going to go into that when I show you alternatives. That is, think of it as a filter in Excel, where you could create a column of what that looks like and filter it out. But it doesn't add to the value of a project, if that makes sense. Okay.
So what if it adds to the value of our project and who we're presenting it to, and we would like for it to become a parent criteria, we can just pull it over there.
Definitely.
Right, to give it more weight than.
Yeah, so if I were to do that, I would take this percent funded, drop it on top of the overall portfolio. It's going to create it. I would have to assign a rating scale for it. So in this case, it would be at the bottom because it's in order. Down here, funded percent. And I'm going to give it an increasing scale because I'm going to assume that 100% funded is a good thing. Okay. So by default, it gives it 0 to 100. You could change that if you wanted to. But this is where you've now created it, and you are going to see this in sensitivity analysis. You're going to see this everywhere, and you can give it weight in the model. Yeah. So that's how you could do that. Okay. All right. Good questions. Participants. I'm going to show you one slide from the deck because I think this one is really important to go over. So in participants, this is where you set permissions for your portfolio. This becomes very important when you actually are sending this to have people access it or make changes to it. And I want to reference this because if you download this deck, you'll see this. There are 5 permissions that you have in a portfolio. The highest is an owner. Sorry. Yeah, one of the highest is an owner. That's what you are when you generate a portfolio. You have the keys to the kingdom, I think, as Michelle used to say, and you can add, edit, delete, change, do everything you want. The one thing you can't do is vote. And what voting is you can do voting for setting the weights of your model, which we all are going to do in a little bit. And as a regular owner, you can't do that. As a voting owner, you can. A lot of times, you're the one managing the portfolio, but you aren't the one that's being solicited for feedback on how important these things are. Maybe you are, but that's why there's 2 different permissions for that. The next is a voter. So a voter is someone who you want to solicit feedback. Maybe you want them to do and weight the criteria in your model, which we're all going to do, but that's all you want them to do. They don't have access to your model. They can't actually go in and see anything. They just participate in that activity and they're done. A reviewer is read-only. So a viewer is someone who you give access to. They can go in and see everything, but they can't do anything. And a voting reviewer allows them to do the voting of an activity and go in and see everything. So if you had stakeholders that are going to participate in setting the weights for your district, your MPO, and you want them to go in and actually see what projects are and what everything translates to, that would be a voting owner. Okay. So with that, I'm going to jump back to my participant screen. So you should see something that looks like this. You should see your name, my name, a couple of Decision Lens folks, and then something called Decision Lens Integrator. And the Decision Lens Integrator account that is under the group called Do Not Remove is because this is where all of the ratings data is stored for your projects. Now, at some point in the near future, right, this might go away when you generate a portfolio. And when that does, you won't see it. You don't need to worry about it anymore. But please do not delete this, as it says, do not delete, as you generate portfolios. Otherwise, all of your project data is going to be gone, unfortunately. Now, what I'd like you to do is I want you to add, in a minute, you're going to add a participant to your model, the person next to you, person behind you, someone else that's not in the room maybe. And what I want you to do is we're going to click on Add. You're going to add the person as a reviewer and see how they show up. Now, there's two ways to add someone. One is clicking on Add Participants and start typing their name, and it might autofill the person's name in. So if I click on Add, like this, and I type in Robert, R-O-B-E-R-T, it's auto-populating a couple of options for Roberts at TXDOT. And the reason that is because Robert, or the Robert I'm looking for, has already been set up in Decision Lens. They already have an account, that maybe they've accessed models, or they participated in some way, and they're in here. However, yeah, did you start typing or no? Right. Did you click on Browse or?
No, I just clicked on participants.
So when you click on Add Participants, you can also click Browse Users, and that would bring up the full list of participants in Decision Lens. Now, for someone who's already been added to Decision Lens previously, and you start typing their name or their email address, you would see it listed here, and you can select it. If you're adding someone who has not accessed Decision Lens before, and you start typing their name and you don't see it, you would put in their full email address. So if I put robert@something.com, it doesn't come up. There is no robert@something.com in this account. If you were to use that and add that person, it would send them an invitation to create their account. So keep that in mind, because as you start building portfolios and giving people access using the permissions page, people that haven't accessed it before are going to be sent an invitation to register. People that have accessed before, they're just going to receive a link that you added them to the account. You can also put in a list of email addresses, and it will assign which ones are new, which ones are not. It'll know. So with that said, I want you to go ahead and add someone as a reviewer. Question.
So if we have people in our office who are not here at this training, how do we get them up to speed with us so that they can work on projects with us once we invite them to this?
Great question. Can I hold that question until after we do this activity?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Please add the person next to you, your neighbor, someone. Add them as a voter. A reviewer. Either one. Yeah. So go ahead and add them. And when you do, you can click Add People, and it will go ahead and add them in this list. So I'm going to add Jared Smith. You can add as a reviewer. That's what I'm going to be doing. And as you do that, you'll notice that there's some check boxes at the bottom. One that's checked by default usually is the notify new participant that they've been added. This is going to send them an email with a link to the portfolio. You can also add a personal message that goes along with that. Okay. All right. I hear emails, which means that people have been inviting people. Okay. So what's kind of nice is that if once you add the person, that portfolio as a reviewer or an owner, that portfolio will show up in Decision Lens for them automatically. So the moment they log in, or if they're already logged in, it's going to show up on the home page. You don't have to do anything. The last thing I wanted to show about participants is this column called groups. Now, groups becomes very useful down the road, and you can add these at any time as you do this. What groups is it allows you to group people together. Big surprise there. But what that means is that as you're looking at results of when you do priority setting or other activities that involve multiple people, you can easily show results based on a group of people. So when we go through the pairwise process in just a minute, I grouped everyone here into different groups, and I did in-class and WebEx, and I'll be able to filter results based on that group of people. And that becomes pretty useful when you have stakeholders from different walks of life in your organization. Engineers versus executives versus project managers versus et cetera. So this is something where you can add people to groups, you can add people to multiple groups, and you could go ahead and use that later on and add these at any time. Okay. So with the person added, you can also change their permissions. So if you wanted to elevate their permissions from reviewer to a voting reviewer or an owner, you can go ahead and change those at any time as well. I will say that best practice is give people the lowest level rights that you think they need and wait until you think they need more or they ask for it. Because if you give everyone the top level rights, things are going to start changing and you're not going to understand why. Yeah, just my experience. Okay. Any questions on participants? It's kind of a nuance, but very important when you actually start building a portfolio. Okay. So, to your question about you went through this training, you started inviting people, what do you do, how do you get them up to speed? So there's a couple answers to that. The first one I'm going to point you to is at the top right of the screen where it says Learn. So if I click on Learn, I can click on the link to go to Decision Lens University. And there's also a link in the community page. So Decision Lens University is Decision Lens online learning and resource center. This is where you can download or watch videos, tutorials, handouts on all parts of Decision Lens. We have learning tracks that allow people to go through the different steps that they would go through as a particular role of using Decision Lens. And the best thing about this is all of the video clips are 2 to 3 minutes long, maybe 4. So if you are asking someone to do something, or if you forgot how to do something, maybe you needed to add criteria or a rating scale and you kind of forgot how to do it, you can come here, put in rating, click enter, and you would be taken to a quick start guide on ratings, rating alternatives 101, quick start guide to do rating alternatives. There's a whole bunch of different resources here. If you didn't want to actually search through the resources, you could do a search. The other thing is that we have these learning tracks where it goes through some typical activities that you would do in Decision Lens, and you can earn certifications for this. We're PMI accredited, so if anyone is working on PMI certifications, you can earn PDUs to that, which is pretty useful. But in general, a lot of the resources for Decision Lens are here. In your packet, Jared's phone number is in there. And, oh, he's awake. No, there's a lot of people in there, myself, Jared, other Decision Lens resources that you can reach out to as well. If you run into a problem, I would also say on Decision Lens at the top, there's also a link to support where you can submit a support ticket or contact our support center. I like to be as responsive as possible, but sometimes I'm busy, like today I'm here. So if it's something that's pretty generic, you can reach out to our support team. If it's very specific, to TXDOT, one of us is probably the best resource because we have access to get in. Now, actually that kind of bridges two topics. When you create a portfolio, the only people that have permissions are whoever you give permissions to. If you call me up tomorrow and say, I'm having a problem with my portfolio, can you help? The first thing I'm going to say is, add me to your portfolio because I can't see it. So just because I work for Decision Lens, I don't have access to your data. That's really important to know. All right. Okay. Let's see. So that was participants and support and DLU all in one. Okay. All right. I think the next thing we're going to go through, we're going to go jump back up one level to alternatives. So go ahead and click on alternatives at the top on the left-hand side. So this is where all of your project data lives. When you generate a portfolio from PMGIS into Decision Lens, most of the project data is going to live here. If you click on a particular project, you'll be able to see all the information about that project on this right-hand pane right here. I have the project name, which I can make adjustments to. I have roadway, I have description, I have district. The roadway, district, county, MPO name, project class, as you can see, these are drop-downs in here. This is what we call alternative categories. To the question before of how funded is a project, and I asked you, does knowing how funded a project is contribute to the value of a project, or do you just want to be able to see it and sort by it? This is what I was referring to with alternative categories. So for instance, the district, the MPO, the project class, these are pieces of information that are useful to know that you may want to filter projects on, but don't actually contribute to the value of a given project. So we set them up as categories in Decision Lens. But what I will show you is that if you take the project, so hopefully you clicked on one project, I want you to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And at the bottom, I see the two new fields that we added as criteria, skid number and percent funded. So this is where I said if you have a new criterion that you're adding and you want to enter in the values for this, you could enter it in here. So if I said this has a skid number of 15 and it's percent funded of 65%, I can add those numbers in here. If I have 10 projects, I can do that. You can actually see those fields on this screen as well. If I scroll all the way to the right, I can see skid number and percent funded. So there are ways that you can go in here and add these in, but if you did want to do it a lot faster, if you had more projects, you'd probably want to import that data in. So from here, one way to import projects in is first you need a list of all the projects so that you can type in that number. So what I'd like everyone to do, if you're on the alternative screen, at the top right is an Excel icon to generate a report. I want you to go ahead and click on that, and that's going to generate a report from this page. All right, I'm going to open up mine. Go and open yours up. Something that is native to almost every Decision Lens page is the ability to export that page's information to Excel. A lot of times you might want to take that, manipulate that, put it into a report, something that isn't native to Decision Lens. So we wanted to make sure that you had the ability to actually get that data and do anything you want with it. In this case, when I export from the alternatives page, it gives me every single alternative and every single data piece of data about this project, including, if I scroll all the way to the right, my SKID number and percent funded. So this would be a great template for you to fill out those fields and then import it in later if you had those new fields that you wanted to. And this does a couple things. One is it makes sure that your project names are correct when you import it in. And two, it just makes sure that you have all the information available for this. So, questions on this piece? Okay. The last thing I wanted to show you on alternatives is how to set up these alternative categories. And this comes into play when you actually review the data later, as we talked about. So from the alternatives page, click on the Customize Fields at the top right. This is where you can create additional categories or drop-down fields for your portfolio. So if you wanted to identify projects as bridge project versus safety project, or the governor's favorite projects, yes or no? As I'm just giving examples here. You could do that by grabbing the category and dropping it onto the right-hand side here. So I could drop a new category, and you can follow along with me, and I'll call it favorite projects. And I'm going to give the options of yes and no. You can create as many of these as you want, and this is what you can, I'll show you later where you will see these and how they become useful. So you can create a category, give it options, click Done, and then when you're ready, click Save and Close at the bottom. Bless you. And what this will do is it will, bless you, it will add this favorite projects here as the second field, which is what I had. And this will allow you to then go in and say, this one is my favorite project, and this one, and that one, but not the others. You can also multi-select projects and do that kind of thing. But this is how you would set up additional categories that you don't have from PMDIS. And I see this as being very useful because as you wanted to say things like, has this been fully funded, or what is the percent funding? If you don't want to actually create a criteria in your model, then this is the other way of doing that. So,
one question.
Yes.
These criteria we are defining, very first time when we are trying to set up, this is good to know. But once I've created all these things, I want to save this so that when I import my next portfolio, I want to retain all these settings. Is there a way to do that? Or every time do I have to go back and start creating this criteria every single time I bring in a new portfolio?
Okay. I'm going to repeat your question so everyone can hear. Okay. So the question was, you build a portfolio, you make a bunch of customizations to it, you add criteria, remove criteria, you add categories, right, people, permissions, and that is what you want to use as your master?
Yes.
And you now have a new set of projects that you want to bring in from PMDIS, but you want it to use this template?
Yes.
Okay. That's a fantastic question. I have an answer for you. There is a way to do it. It's not very straightforward that I can think of. Basically, what we can do is you can copy the portfolio from Decision Lens, and one of the options that you have is copying it with or without alternatives. So if you copy it without alternatives, that would leave it as a blank template. I believe you could then take from PMDIS the post-processed export file that would export as an Excel file and import that into Decision Lens, not using the integration, because the integration would generate a new portfolio. If you download the post-process file and import it into Decision Lens and map all the fields to what you have, it will import into your template that was blank, that would then be populated with projects and values and things like that. It's extra steps because you'd have to manually import it. There is an import wizard, which I wasn't going to go into, but Decision Lens does have an import wizard where you choose a file and you map fields in your file to existing fields in Decision Lens and do it that way. But you could do it that way, and that would retain the permissions and the setup and all of that of your original portfolio.
Now, what about the data? Like, skip, for instance, 1 to 100.
It would say that
New
too.
project, it would be
Right. Good.
1 to 200.
Good question. Yeah. So if you were to keep the original portfolio and copy it as a template without alternatives, it would retain the rating scale that you copied it from, and you would be responsible for setting those mins and max. Typically what that looks like is when you export that post-process file from PMDIS and you look at all those columns, if they had a filter on it, you could click and see what the low and the high is, and you just set that up. Depending on the customizations that you've made to your portfolio and how important they are to you, you'd probably weigh the benefit of setting it up again versus doing this copy method. So there is a way to do it, but it takes a little bit of work. That's my answer. What?
I think it's like very first time when we set up, it's just the one time. After that, it's just going to be like repetitions. Instead of putting this effort every single time, I was trying to say like what's the easiest way.
Yeah, and
Don't have to do that every single time.
right.
I think if your projects were always going to be consistently the same, that would be a benefit, but your projects, you can't assume that your projects are always going to be consistently the same. In other words, you're not always going to have the same criteria and the same alternatives to work with. So that's something to consider, but, I mean, obviously going forward, there may be a way to improve that process if there's a need for it, so.
There's also something that we've talked about is we're not super geniuses that know literally everything in the entire world. So if you come up with a criterion that sounds like it'd be really good for everybody, and you find yourself having to add it to every portfolio you create, tell TXDOT, and we could probably just make it part of the default for everyone.
Okay. Or we can add that field that you could then choose to bring in as a criterion or not as well. Because not all data fields are criteria. All right. Good question. Complicated question.